Now let me welcome Dr. Rachel Buckley to discuss how gender, which we know it does, impacts the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. Rachel, you are Australian, trained at University of Melbourne. So in what way did you actually observe that women look at memory in a different way? When did you get interested in that aspect? Because you are so young.
That's right. My PhD was focused on memory concerns. I was very interested in when people start to notice that the disease is building, as Rebecca very beautifully put it. You do notice signs early. And in fact, women are very in tune with their bodies, particularly so. There's something that we notice coming out of my PhD and other work across the world, that women do really notice changes very, very early on. In addition, actually, there are also changes that happen to memory and other thinking abilities during menopause. These two aren't necessarily linked, but I do think that gives women a primer of how things might change and being much more aware of that. But on top of that, there are more facets to this, because women are also more in tune with other people's bodies too. So often we'll notice in the memory clinic cohorts that we research that women will often bring their spouses when they become concerned about their spouse's memory. And so I think there's lots of components to women noticing changes in memory.
Yeah, so in Boston, under the mentorship of a much admired Professor Reza Sperling, you were encouraged to look at why women are more at risk for Alzheimer's disease than men. What intrigued you most about the biology, and what finally did you find when it comes to some of the markers we are exposed to, tau, amyloids? So what can we say from a biological, biochemical point of perspective?
There are fascinating components to women's risk for Alzheimer's disease, particularly. When we first started looking into this question, it became very clear to us that no one had really looked very deeply at the differences between men and women in their risk for the actual disease in the brain. As you mentioned, and the other speakers have mentioned, there are two hallmark pathologies of Alzheimer's disease: the amyloid plaques in the brain and the tau tangles. And we have some of the largest studies in the world looking at positron emission tomography. We use PET scans to look at amyloid and tau in the brain and see where they're actually lighting up in the brain while people are living. And what we noticed is in those individuals who are all healthy, there are no issues with memory or thinking. What we noticed is that women and men show very similar levels of amyloid plaques. There really is no, in thousands and thousands of scans that we've looked at, there really is no evidence of differences in amyloid. But where things start to show very, very big differences is in tau tangles. We see that across a lot of regions of the brain, women show much higher levels of tau, which led us to think, okay, what could be driving this? And this is where we get from the twinkle to the wrinkle. The first element that we were really interested in is menopause, this sort of midlife changing cessation of hormones and other aspects that really cause a huge event in a woman's life. And what we started to notice in some of our data, and in fact other data across the world, is that menopause might actually, elements of menopause might be playing a key role in driving higher levels of tau in women. The other aspect is the X chromosome. The really fascinating thing about that is that it's telling us a story. The X chromosome is telling us a story, not just about susceptibility, but also about resilience. And I think harkening back to the joy aspect of what we've been discussing, I don't think that this story about women's health and Alzheimer's disease is just about vulnerability or susceptibility. There is actually also a very strong story to tell about resilience too.
Thank you. So you spoke already about the menopause. So what actually contributes during this menopause phase to this enhanced tau tangled building, which obviously are correlating very well with the cognitive decline? What is it? Is it change in estrogens? Is it hormone therapy? Is it change in sleep? What are the factors driving potentially this tau pathology?
I'm so glad that you asked me that question, because actually right now we're still not entirely clear. And I think that's why we're at such a fantastic and critical point in research right now. I think we've got some really interesting data to hand. There is definitely an argument to be made that earlier age at menopause, whether it's via surgery or just it happens naturally, is linked with higher risk for both the dementia and also the proteins in the brain. We've noticed that earlier age in menopause is associated with higher level of those tau tangles I was referring to earlier, but also other studies have shown that earlier age at menopause is associated with higher rates of progression to the dementia later in life. There is also a lot of interesting evidence coming out of clinical trials to suggest that hormone therapy might play a role, but there are a lot of nuances associated with that. It is not all hormone therapy, and it is not all women who take hormone therapy that increases risk. And we can touch on that later if you're interested. But there are other aspects of menopause as well. As you touched upon, changing sleep is a huge marker of menopause. And we know that sleep is very closely linked with Alzheimer's disease risk, both in the midlife and in later life. We also know that there is hugely skyrocketing changes in cardiovascular risk. And we know cardiovascular risk is a big risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. And we also know that there are other changes that really affect mood. There's hot flashes. Other symptoms of menopause can also play a role. We've also noticed in some early data that also the severity of symptoms might be of interest too. So there's a milieu of things happening in menopause that I think need to be really considered, and we need to understand how all of these factors are playing a role together, combined in the midlife to influence disease risk down the line.
Do you think there's enough research being done on this aspect? I mean, I have quite often discussions with friends in the scientific field who are asking question, hormone therapy, yes or no? So what recommendations would you actually give to women at the age of 40 to 50, and what recommendation maybe to the 60 plus? What?
So I'll start off with the question of what would I recommend. It's a wonderful question. And first off, I would say I'm not a clinician, so I'm going to be coming at this from the research. The data that we know is exactly what I said before, which is we know that hormone therapy can increase risk, but most of those largest clinical trials on hormone therapy were actually targeting a specific question, which was, if you initiate hormone therapy later in life, say 65 and over, is that associated with increased comorbidities? Dementia was one of those. And what they found is that in women who initiated hormone therapy after the age of approximately 65, there was almost doubled risk for dementia on certain formulations. Now, this was fascinating to people because they thought that estrogens would be protective. But what we now know is that the story is a lot more nuanced. That if you are taking hormone therapy very, very close in time to your age at menopause, that your risk for dementia is not increased. We do not see significant changes in cognition over a period of 10 years, 15 years. And we don't necessarily see all these other risks involving pathology. Mind you, in saying that, there is a lot that we don't know. A lot of the deeply characterized cohorts for Alzheimer's disease, the cohorts that I tend to work with, we don't ask questions about menopause. It is not traditionally asked. We don't tend to focus on women's health. And so there's a lot of unknowns in these really well-characterized cohorts. On the other side, there are some incredible cohorts of hormone therapy and menopause, but these women are often younger. And one thing that we really want to do is try to get these women to come back when they're in their 70s and see if there is increased risk for pathology as well as dementia. This is a study that has not yet been done. This is a study that we would like to do across America, and in fact, even across Europe if we can. And this addresses your first point, which is what more is there to be done? And that is low-hanging fruit in my mind.
Fascinating. Thank you, Rachel, for your insights and leadership in the field. We come back to this because I have, of course, a very important question, and which is how can lifestyle changes contribute to this journey?